Welcome to the next video in the formulize tutorial series. In this video we'll discuss calculation options. There are several calculations that are possible. You can get to them through the calculations button, and then you get a box that shows up, and you can run these just the same as doing a search or a sort. You can just activate a calculation and then it will remain in effect as you change different other features of the entries that you're looking at. So you start by picking which column you want to get information about. So let's maybe start with what type of animal was it, and then you have a choice of calculations that you're going to perform. Most of them are numeric. Calculations are meant to basically help you with numbers, give you totals or averages and so on. So total, average, minimum value, maximum value, counting how many entries there are that are currently in the list, and a percentage breakdown, which is the most complex calculation. So let's pick that one to see what that's like. And you say add the calculations to the list. Now the calculation system, because the number of options, is a multi-step process to interact with. We could pick more things here. We could pick say the time of day, and we could do a count and a percentage on that, or you can start to pick various things. We could do all those three calculations on each of those three entries, and then we could say add to the list. We'd end up with a whole lot more calculations down here under requested, but we don't actually want to do that right now. Let's keep it simple. For each calculation that you have requested and put in the list, then there's a number of things that you can do here. You can control whether for this calculation you're going to include or exclude entries that are blank or have zeros. And you can get quite specific about that. You can exclude only blanks or include only blanks, or do various different things. You can also have a custom list that you want to exclude. Whatever is in this list is going to be included or excluded. We could, for example, say let's exclude beaver from the list. That's one of the animals that's showing up there, and this would remove that from the list. This would ignore that entry as far as the calculation is concerned. We don't, however, want to do that, so we'll just leave it the way it was. You can also group results if you wish to have say do a sum total, but you essentially want to see subtotals based on another field. If we had, say, the number of beavers and the number of pigs that had been seen, maybe we'd want to group those by, we want to see the total number, but grouped by animal. And then you get a subtotal for how many of each. So we'll just leave this as the basics now. We don't want to do anything especially fancy at the moment. So we'll just once we've got the options the way we want, or if you're just leaving them as the default, then you can click the perform requested calculations button, and that will take all the settings that you have got in the list, and that will run them. So formulize will now give you a bit of a different view. We're not seeing the list of entries anymore. We're seeing calculation results. So it says what type of animal was it? That's the question that we were doing a calculation on. And the percentage breakdown results, which exclude blanks and zeros, they say, okay, we've got one wild pig and one beaver, and the percentages are 50-50, obviously, in this simple example. Now there's a few additional UI options that we've got here. We can modify the calculations if we wanted to change things, and you can just close this window always if you don't want to just reactivate it. We can cancel the calculations, and we can switch to the entries, and so there's this sort of back and forth here. When we're on the entries list, we've got the same choices up top, and so we can switch back to the calcs. So it's like we can just sort of go back and forth from looking at our calculation results to looking at our entries, and it's just sort of two sides of the same coin. Now, something that does kick in here is, for example, the scope that we had set in the previous video. Entries by volunteers and rangers is still there, and it's part of our it's having an effect on our calculation. If we pick different groups, like say just the volunteer group, then if we use those groups as the scope now, we're down to 1. Our list contains one entry, the wild pig entry, which represents 100% of the entries that are there. There is only one. So just like everything else, calculations and formulize are additive. They remain in effect while everything else is going on. And they'll respond to changes that you make in the list based on the scope, or based on searches, or based on whatever other changes that you're making. So that's a very brief look at calculations. They can be saved along with everything else. All the active settings get saved when you save a view. We'll look at saving views in a future video. And they could be, of course, quite useful for reporting purposes. You might want to make a series of calculations and then check them periodically. If you use time-based searches with calculations, so if you put in one of those time-based searches that we looked at in a previous video, such as today minus 14 and today greater than 14, this search will give you basically a floating 4-week window around the current date. So whenever if you save this view, then whenever you came back to it, you would get a 14-day window around the current date of all the entries that were created by volunteers, and you would then have a calculation in effect that would show you the distribution of how many animals, what percentages of different types of animals the volunteers had seen in that 2-week period. So there's lots of different things you can do once you start combining the features of formulize to create interesting and useful reports. And it's really up to you what calculations you want to run and what other settings you want to trigger. But obviously there's many useful things you could do with that. Last word about features in the calculations. When you click modify, you get your whole list here based on the ones that you had set up. You can remove the calculations from the list at any time, and in this case we only had one, so now our whole list is gone. If you had other calculations, then they would still be there. You can pick different ones at this point and carry on with something else. So that's all for calculations. We'll move on to some other topics. Hope you found that useful.